So I think today we thought we might have a chat around, what is it to build an accessible and inclusive experience, and how do we go about that? What are sort of some of the tips that we would give to organizations to say how to effectively, actually create, great experiences? I think Simon has summed up, what does it mean to have an accessible experience so well? And, when Andrew and I were talking about this, we sort of boiled it down to, everyone can do what they want in the way that they want. Nothing fancy, really that for us is the core of what it means to have an accessible experience.
And that could well be very, very different from the way myself or Sarah or many of you experience the digital world. And if you think about what the digital world is, we're sitting on a Zoom platform tonight this evening on in a web interface or in Zoom itself, but there's much more than what you do with a computer. Think about things like gaming machines, ATMs, smart TVs, smart watches. Everything we do these days has a digital connection somewhere along the line by and large.
And for anyone who's kind of in that user experience space, when we look at accessible experiences, I think one of the awesome ways to look at it is in terms of user needs. So for anyone who's familiar with government and the Australian Digital Service Standard, that's actually the first principle of the Digital Service Standard is understanding user needs. And I like that particularly because, first of all, it takes away from I'm going to say disability. Do you have a disability? Don't you have a disability? Simon mentioned how, you might have more energy in the morning, less in the afternoon. It really just comes down to and boils down to different, people have different needs. That could be different technologies they could be using. That could be different energy levels, different situations they find themselves in. And so, it's a great way to actually then focus around how do we build those accessible experiences?
I think we need to think, it's not just people with disability who are going to benefit from that research and what we're all talking about tonight. All of us will find ourselves with a temporary disability at some point, an environmental disability. I've got to make sure I go to the ATM before the sun's setting because the local ATM where I live faces west and I can't see the screen even if I shield it with my body at that time of the day. So, I've effectively got an environmental disability just because of the way the bank faces in the street and the glare on that ATM screen. And I think we've all probably experienced those types of things from time to time.
And it's a great way because it shifts, I think, that conversation. It's just we see accessibility as just part of good user experience. If we're doing things right, if we're being inclusive, if we're building things to be inclusive, then, there's nothing more that we really need to do.
Yep. So just thinking about, the different ways that people, access digital content. Basically, what we're looking for to build is a flexible user interface that allows people to adapt it. Sure, I can't turn that ATM around, but if I'm outside with my mobile phone, I can probably find some shade to be able to see that screen better. So I've been able to move the physical device, but mostly we're looking at how somebody might be able to adapt that interface so that it meets their needs at that point in time. So for a lot of people, with a variety of vision impairments, for instance, it might be changes to the text size, making it bigger. It might be changing to the text color. And I did work with a woman once who used red text on a pink background, and it was pretty ghastly from my perspective, but it's what worked for her. And that's the type of changes that the flexibility that we need to allow people to do to personalize to what will work for them in their situation from time to time. Some people get just very tired by the end of the day. So, trying to concentrate on very small text that they might start the day with, they can increase the text by the end of the day as their eyes are wearying, for instance.
I think it's so important because there is no one size that fits all. So often in accessibility, for instance, one of the things a lot of people know about is contrast, having good contrast between, say, text and background, and that's great for people with, say, low vision. Often, if you are using your mobile phone in sunny conditions, there's a whole lot of benefits of that. But for some people with dyslexia, actually that high contrast can make it more difficult to read text. And so giving people that flexibility to change it depending on what their needs are is one of those sort of core things that we talk about when we talk about designing for accessibility.
The other side of it is, how are people inputting into a digital device? I sit there and I type, and I don't use a mouse because I've had RSI and I now use a trackball, but there's all sorts of different ways that people are going to actually interact with, in terms of, making sure that they can put the stuff in to get the stuff back again. Now, a lot of people will be navigating just with a keyboard on a typical computer. But a keyboard means if you can interact with the screens just with a keyboard, then somebody who can't even use a keyboard, they might be using a switch device of one sort or another, either a big lollipop switch or a sip and puff switch, or a whole variety of different physical switch devices. They'll be able to navigate because then they can interact with a virtual keyboard.
And Simon had sort of, highlighted some of those assistive technologies, and in particular, voice recognition, which is, another technology that can be used as an input method. Another assistive technology that's commonly talked about in accessibility, I once read it's the poster child of accessibility, even though we don't necessarily want it to be, is the good old screen reader. So piece of technology usually used by people that are blind that reads out information on the screen. But it doesn't just read out text, it tells you all sorts of things like, is this a heading? Is it a link? Is it a form field? So all those things that as sort of, I guess, if you are a sighted person and you see those things from an interface are actually coming through the screen reader via audio or also via a braille device. So a tactile display for people who are either blind and are braille users, or people that are deafblind as well.
Yep, and it's not just people with vision impairments that'll be having stuff read to them. A lot of people with lower vision impairments may be magnifying the screen, and in some cases that means they've got to scroll left and right. So rather than do that and having to scroll left and right and up and down, which takes a lot of effort to be able to read a page of text if it doesn't reformat to fit the screen size, they'll have those bits of text read out to them. People with dyslexia and sometimes and other learning disabilities may well also have the text read out to them. And I know a few people who turn captions on, for instance, in a video, even though they can see and hear perfectly well, because they find it just helps them concentrate and get the entire message out of that video, because they can lose concentration if one of their senses isn't following what's on the screen.
So far we've talked about adaptability or flexibility of UI, assistive technologies or different inputs and outputs. And the last thing is just the design, like, things that we do within our design that make it more or less accessible. And one of the call outs we wanted to make is around just plain understandable language. I know this is a big one for Andrew, so I'm going to throw over to you, Andrew, because you can get on your soapbox around this one.
Yes, and we, up until very recently, have forgotten about the content by and large when we've been thinking about designing interfaces, designing websites, designing services, even the interface to the smart TV or the gaming device. But the content is really what helps us understand what we're supposed to do, or the information that a particular service provider, be it government or a retailer or a bank, is actually expecting us to absorb and to be able to understand what they can offer us, or how we should be interacting with them. And we're finding more and more organisations are now paying a lot more attention to that content and saying, okay, we have to write it in plain language. In Australia, that primarily means plain English. it doesn't mean writing it in simple English. It means writing it in plain English, keeping using an active voice, keeping the sentences short, one idea in a paragraph, all those good writing techniques, making sure that we don't use idioms and things like, there wasn't room to swing a cat. If you don't understand what room to swing a cat means, you start to think, what on earth am I missing here? All that type of stuff can make it so much easier. The surveys that they've done around literacy in Australia has shown that it's a bit less than half of the people have on a scale of 1 to 5, have a reading ability of 3 or less, which means that there's a lot of people out there who are going to understand if we write as though we were university lecturers, PhD students, and so on. It's fine to write that when you've got a sophisticated audience, and a lot of people, all the writing people say, don't make sure you write for the audience, but still use plain language. Surveys have shown that lawyers and doctors and engineers still appreciate plain language because it means they can read something more quickly, even though you're using all the technical terms that they understand. They don't want to. A lot of people are time poor and they don't want to waste their time trying to work out what you mean with long paragraphs and long sentences and big words.
So how do we go about creating accessible experiences? I love to ask this. So in the chat, say yes or something like that if you have tried to read WCAG. So WCAG is the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. It's considered sort of the international standard around accessibility. So who has tried to read WCAG at any point in time? Got a few no's, but a few yeses coming through. And thank you, Matthew, for the link. We're about split. A few yeses, you know. So of those people who are saying yes, who has enjoyed reading WCAG? I've got painful. Heck no. Hell no. It's not an easy read and a sad face. So, look, WCAG is a standard, and unfortunately, it is a very, very dense document. And it's. Am I implying the accessibility standards are not accessible? I am happy to say in WCAG 3.0 that they're currently working on, they have that very squarely in mind that standard WCAG 2.0 at the moment isn't, or 2.1 I should say, isn't the most readable. No, I'm not selling it, Danielle. So actually, I am known as a person who really loves WCAG. In my team, I am known as the walking WCAG Bible because you tend to be able to throw me a question and I can tell you, right, yep, it's this criteria, this requirement, and off we go. But what we want to call out is that WCAG is, it is a great resource, but it is only a technical standard. At its heart, when we talk about accessible experiences, it's all about usability. Can users use this product? So although WCAG helps us, it can help us, find some of those technical issues, things that should be, just part of our practice of building good websites, but it is not the only thing that we should be focusing on when we talk about accessibility. Something is accessible, that's not synonymous with it has met all of the WCAG requirements.
Essentially, it is the technical requirement that most of what you need to follow to make sure that a wide range of people with a wide range of disabilities using a wide range of different means of accessing your content or your service will be able to technically access it. But there are many ways of interpreting those success criteria in WCAG, and if you interpret them one way, you will make it easy for people. If you interpret it another way, you may make it very hard for people. I was working with a retailer 18 months ago now, I think it was the middle of last year, and we were doing some usability, having given them some technical advice 12 months earlier from that. And they'd sort of said, okay, now we're now going to go off, you've told us what's wrong with a few things, we're going to go off and get it all right, and then we'll come back and get you to test it. And what they presented as the user interface was quite nice. Technically, it was a perfectly good technical solution, but I had 3 screen reader users trying it out because that was the target audience they wanted to make sure they were getting right for because they'd had trouble with screen reader users complaining in the past. One of the screen reader users was able to work out the particular interface that they designed, the menu system. The other 2 just could not get beyond the menu system and had to be guided through that process of getting to the right part of the store to be able to try and buy something. So they hadn't been talking to users while they've been building it. They've been following the technical guidance, of which there are many different ways of building things. And as I said, this was technically perfect. It just wasn't what the users were expecting or what their experience had led them to believe a menu should operate like.
And I think that's what we're always trying to, when we're working with organizations, is, basically educating people and organizations to say, hey, look, basically talk to your users. We shouldn't treat accessibility different to usability and user experience. So if, including users in your research, including users in your usability testing, making sure you are getting that feedback from your users, because that is the true test of whether something is actually accessible.
So we often talk about in the accessibility community now about shifting left. It used to be, the opinion that making sure accessibility was addressed was the responsibility of the dev at the end of the day. And then after you released it, you would go and test it against the technical spec to make sure that it was all okay. These days, everybody or nearly everybody is saying, move it right back to the start. As Sarah said, do research with users before you even start designing to make sure you understand what their needs are, the different ways that they might interact with existing products even. Make sure you think about it at the design phase when you're doing the mock-ups, the graphic designs. Think about it while you're preparing content at that point even.
And that shift left concept is all about making accessibility also more cost effective. If we can build in accessibility at the right point in time, we're not fixing it at the end. We're not finding we've got contrast issues at the end. We're not finding we've done something, wrong in the code at the end. We've actually built it in and addressed it at the right point in time. Because that's often, we get pushback from organizations saying, oh, accessibility, it's so expensive, it's so hard. If we do a lot of these things, if we get it in at the right time, if we build up our capability, and that's still definitely a work in progress for a lot of organizations, we're actually building things to be accessible rather than getting to the end and trying to retrofit accessibility.
And what that leads into is saying that, everybody in the team, from the user researcher, the UX designer, the graphic designer, the content author, right through to the dev or the engineer, the person who's doing the QA, the project manager, everybody has some responsibility rather than one person having to understand everything about accessibility. Everybody does a little bit and then it's a shared load and it's much easier to address right throughout the process.
And I think we'll leave it there.